When we think of the largest British expedition of the 18th century, we often look towards the American Revolution or the Seven Years' War. But decades earlier, in 1741, the British launched an armada of over 180 ships and nearly 30,000 men across the Atlantic. Their target? The Spanish stronghold of Cartagena in modern-day Colombia. It was the largest fleet the Royal Navy had ever assembled up to that point and was commanded by one of Britain's newest military heroes. It should have been an overwhelming victory. Instead, it became a masterclass in the friction of war. Between the harsh jungle environment, a brilliant Spanish defense, a horrific outbreak of disease, and a British command structure that utterly despised each other, the expedition devolved into one of the most catastrophic military failures of the age. Welcome back to Prime and Load. My name is Lee Gugino, and as always, I'm joined by Doctors Alex Burns and Andrew Bamford. Today, we're heading to the Caribbean to talk about the War of Jenkins Ear and the infamous 1741 expedition against Cartagena. To help us untangle this doomed campaign, we're joined by historian Tom Golding Lee. Together, we look under the hood of how the British managed this incredible feat of logistics, the brand new regiments that are raised specifically for this meat grinder, the stubborn Spanish defenders, and the unique horrors of 18th century jungle combat. We also dive into the ultimate failure of command and control, the deeply toxic relationship between Admiral Edward Vernon and General Thomas Wentworth, and how their bitter relationship sealed the fate of thousands of men. Thank you for joining us for A Failure of Command.
To introduce yourself, first of all, Tom, do you want to tell us a little bit about who you are and how you became interested in a fairly esoteric topic?
Yeah, so hi everyone. As Andrew said, I'm Tom Golding Lee. I'm a professional military analyst, I guess you could say, working in the defense industry in the UK, and I'm also a war game developer as well as part of that job. I've been doing that for about 10 years, but my interest in the Cartagena campaign actually came from way back when I was at university, studying at King's College London in the War Studies department, and I wrote my undergraduate thesis on British amphibious operations, basically from the Cartagena campaign in 1741, all the way up to the failed invasion of what is now Haiti in the 1790s. And that was looking at kind of a comparative history of why did they succeed, why did they fail, were there any differentiating factors, and what were those factors if they existed. And then probably going back quite a few years now, Andrew put a call out on Twitter, as it was back then, for is there anyone who can write about the War of Jenkins Ear? And so a friend of mine actually tagged me and said, I think Tom knows a bit about this. And ever since then, it's sort of spiraled a little bit, but it's become, I think it's become a bit of an obsession of mine, actually, and it's a nice bit of history to learn about. When there's a really excellent history written by Craig Chapman a couple of years back called "Disaster on the Spanish Main," but other than that, modern works on it are pretty thin on the ground. So you actually get to plow some real furrows in new history, which is really good fun.
So just to get into the history then, and well, perhaps to get into the geography first, just to locate us. So whereabouts in the world are we with Cartagena? It's perhaps not a place that everybody's immediately familiar with these days.
Yeah. So if you've seen the new series of The Night Manager on the BBC, the city they go to on the coast, Cartagena. That is the Cartagena we're in. So we're talking the northern-ish coast of Colombia in Latin America, New Granada, obviously in the 18th century. The viceroyalty of New Granada, and really we're looking at what is now the very old UNESCO World Heritage Site protected part of the city. That's the city as it was then. That's the prize the British are after, and obviously the wider campaign then spans the whole of that part of the Caribbean, going into Saint Domingue, which is now Haiti, and Cuba as well, and Panama. So that kind of whole eastern half of the Caribbean is really the stage for this showdown between Britain and Spain.
And I mentioned in the introduction, this is the War of Jenkins Ear. I mean, again, for listeners not familiar, who was Jenkins? Why was his ear important? And why was it worth fighting a war over? What was at stake in this?
Well, as a proud Welshman, and whose family, I know you could never necessarily get that from my accent, but as a proud Welshman whose family are from Llanelli, Jenkins going to war over the abuse of a merchant from Llanelli is cause enough in my mind in of itself. But really, we're looking at a very long-running dispute between the British and the Spanish, and this is really the last big war that is pretty much only Britain and Spain. It's the kind of the tail end of that rivalry that goes all the way back to the Reformation. But the specific casus belli for this campaign is spins out of the Treaty of Utrecht in 1714. So the British win as part of that peace treaty a contract called the Asiento. I probably won't say the whole name just because we don't upset the algorithm at all. But the Asiento is a contract that allows a provider, whoever that provider might be, previously it had been held by the Dutch and then other people in Spain as well, to provide enslaved people from Africa to the Latin American colonies of Spain. Because Spain operates this mercantilist system, you need contracts run through the government in Seville and Cadiz to actually do any kind of commerce with Latin America. And Britain, you can say that the War of Spanish Succession is a draw. You could say the British lost and the French won. I don't think that's true. But really for Britain, Gibraltar and the Asiento, they're huge prizes. They're absolutely massive deal. As part of the Asiento, the British are also allowed to trade more than just enslaved people with the Spanish. They get one ship a year to trade other goods. But what it becomes is a dispute over, are the British smuggling? Are they using the Asiento as a fig leaf to get basically whatever the hell they like into Spain's Latin American colonies? I think the consensus on that is pretty much, yeah. It's not. If you know anything about the British Empire and its trading policies, that cannot shock you in the slightest. And if you know anything about the Spanish Empire, their response to that is pretty brutal. So they have the Guarda Costa, who are they're not the Coast Guard. They are basically privateers who very loosely enforce customs laws. And basically, for the next 25 years, in between the Peace of Utrecht and the declaration of war, the Guarda Costa wages a kind of low-level war on British merchant shipping in the Caribbean. And eventually, this gets too much for the British merchantry in Parliament to bear. So there's a brief war. It's not even really a war. It's kind of an armed confrontation between Britain and Spain in 1726, I believe, 27. And that's Admiral Hogier's Ghost. There's a famous song. The British send a fleet to blockade the coast of Latin America and they all die hideously of fever. This is a story that becomes quite a familiar one when we talk about this one later. So eventually, the Prime Minister at the time, Sir Robert Walpole, he's sometimes called our first Prime Minister. You can debate whether that's true. He is one of these guys. He's quite a modern figure in many ways. You kind of see sort of, I guess, in the language of the day, he'd kind of be like an establishment progressive kind of politician. For people perhaps of my ancestors' persuasions, he was a Whig oligarch, a tyrant, and all that was wrong with the political establishment since 1688. You'd never hear me say anything like that. But he is essentially running this policy of peace through prosperity and prosperity through peace. He does not want to spend money on a war. He does not want the war to cost the treasury and to essentially disrupt trade. However, I think it's 77 ships are captured in about a decade. And then after some negotiations in the mid-1730s, it moves to 10 a year. And really, when Parliament, you think the influence of the merchantry in Parliament is huge. They're clamoring for war, and they kind of lead the faction called the Patriot Whigs. So you have the government Whigs, who are kind of the anti-war faction. You have the Patriot Whigs, who are, in all essence, the same political persuasion as the government. They just think we should go to war with Spain, we being Britain. You also have the Tories, who various shades of this is none of our business, but we should go and fight the Spanish, all the way to people who are basically out-and-out Jacobites, and some of the people who are in opposition during this campaign then go into armed opposition 5-6 years down the line in 1745. So it's a very slow, long-burning, 25-year process, but it reaches that culmination, like I say, in the late 1730s. The Spanish capture 10 ships in a year, and really this is too much for the government to deal with. And this culminates in this chap Jenkins, who allegedly has his ear sliced off by the Guarda Costa off the coast of Cuba. And one of his great patrons and sort of champions in the press is a chap called Benjamin Franklin. much better known for his later and less salubrious works, I have to say, in support of issues in America. But he champions Jenkins' cause initially, and there's sort of a legend that Jenkins displays his ear in Parliament in front of a select committee. Again, it's not necessarily clear if he did that or if that's just the Victorians making it up. But it's a great story, and it becomes the kind of, even at the time, it was the rallying cry. There are great woodcuts of him in coffee houses with his ear in a jar full of vinegar. And essentially, in the summer of 1739, after this 25 years and all these abuses, the government say, okay, we cannot maintain a majority in the House of Commons if we don't declare war on Spain. And they wait for the summer recess to be over, and then in the autumn of 1739, they formally declare war against the Spanish. And that's how, after a very long burn and a lot of sort of, there's the South Sea Company, the South Sea Bubble, all of this stuff gets wrapped into it. I'm not very financially literate, so please don't ask me about that. But that then leads to the declaration of war and the confrontation in 1739.
So we've got war breaking out in 1739. The campaign that you're primarily interested in is 1741. So could you just briefly take us through what happens in the first couple of years of the war?
Yeah, so not very much is the answer to that.
Right, next question.
Yeah, there's one huge battle. I don't know if Alex Lee, if you've ever been to London and you've ever been to Portobello Market, Portobello Road. That is named after the one major engagement that happens in 1739, right after war is declared. Admiral Vernon, who becomes kind of very important to this story, Edward Vernon, Old Grog, he's the guy that literally invents grog, the rum, lime, water mix that sailors drink. He is sent out with a small squadron to the Caribbean, and he basically, in a couple of days, takes Portobello in Panama, steals a fortune in prizes and goods, booty, all the rest of it, and carts it off. He becomes a national hero overnight. And it's really interesting because he had been a patriot Whig. He was a leading proponent of actually going to war in the first place. It's kind of why he got the command, kind of a, yeah, you've got what you want, now go away situation. But he makes a really good job of it. So very, very early on in the war, like a couple of months into it, he wins that victory, tries to repeat it in March of 1740, I believe, in a naval-only attack on Cartagena with a few of the Jamaican independent companies in attendance as well. And Cartagena is a much bigger nut to crack. The defences are much well organised. They pull back to Jamaica for that bit. But really, the back end of 1739 and all of 1740 are Britain getting itself ready for war after 25 years of peace. You can make allusions to the modern world if you wish. 25 years of peace. The army's not in a great state. You've got 45 battalions of foot on the strength. That includes the foot guards. So, if you're doing episodes on Kesselsdorf and the like, that's probably less than one of the armies that's fighting in one of those major European battles. That's assuming all these regiments are at strength, which, hint, hint, they're not. The army socially is seen as a very low, kind of, I don't want to say low rent, but it's not a well-regarded profession either by people in Britain or the French. I think there's a great quote, and it's from the 7 Years' War, but it really sums up the kind of the view of the British Army at the time, which is their officers are gentlemen. They are led by gentlemen who are not officers, and their men are brave without being soldierly, which kind of sums up a French view of the British Army, but I don't think it's that unfair in the 1730s and 40s. So really, there's this debate at home about what we send out. Because King George II, and some historians write this as silly George II. Bearing in mind what happens later on, it's probably actually not the silliest thing in the world. He's really worried about a French invasion and a Jacobite restoration. So he says you've got to keep the army back at home, either to go and help out Hanover, if that's attacked by the French, or to prevent the Jacobites from rising up and kicking me out. So he didn't want to send the regular army. You could argue either way. I think that's kind of understandable from a regime and dynasty perspective, if actually that is the most important thing. This war is far away. So they kind of think, okay, what are we actually going to send out to go and fight against Spain? And they settle in November of 1739 on the concept of the Marine regiments. Now, this isn't the Royal Marines that we all know and love today. This is a different organization. They're actually organized as part of the army rather than as part of the admiralty, and we can probably come on to why that is later on. But the beginning of 1740 is basically spent getting those men ready to go to the Caribbean, because I think the British know this is going to be a hard campaign. I found some documents in the National Archives looking at the hospitals they were preparing, and I don't think anyone's really talked about them before. In the letters where they're basically saying we need some hospitals because this is going to be a terrible climate to fight in, they're not completely naive as to what is going to go on when they go out there. But it's imperative for the British government that they essentially raise a completely new force and send it over, which is not without difficulty. Part of the reason they pick Marines is because there is still a fear in Britain at the time. This is kind of the tail end of the Glorious Revolution generation. So they're genuinely worried if they make the standing army too big, it will be used as a tool to oppress British liberty. And you can say that's cynical. In a modern, we might sort of twig our eyebrows at that, but they really worried about that at the time. So they settle on this concept of we'll raise we'll raise 6 Marine regiments, 6 battalions, and we'll also raise an American regiment from our colonies across the water, who will then link up with the British Army when it gets to the Caribbean and carry out a descent on Latin America.
All right, can we hear about then the folks who my students at Franciscan will view as the good guys, the Spanish, their leadership, how many troops do they have, that kind of thing?
So the Spanish, they're led by a chap called Blas de Leso, who is a Spanish friend of mine who's a naval historian. She described him as Spanish Nelson, at which point I sort of couldn't breathe for about half an hour after she said that. I was like, how dare you? But I think in fairness, she's actually kind of right. So he lost an arm, he lost at least a hand, if not, no, sorry, lost a leg, lost at least a hand, if not an arm, lost an eye fighting against Britain. He's a hard man. He hates the British. He's an incredibly competent, patient, I think, military officer. He is backing up the kind of the boy wonder Sebastian de Eslava, who's the viceroy of New Granada. He is kind of more of a political appointee, but does very competently in this one. And then there's a chap called Carlos Desnos, who you might guess is French, or at least of French extraction. And there are quite a few of these sort of guys of French extraction who end up in Spanish America in various capacities. He's the chief engineer and builds all the additional defenses you see during the siege. So Cartagena itself, it's defended by about 1,000 sailors, about 1,000 militiamen-ish, and about 2,000 regulars. So about 4,000 defenders all told, and they do have some native allies as well, but I'm not really sure how many of those there were, to be honest with you. Cartagena itself sits on a kind of bow-shaped lagoon that runs north to south, with an island that basically turns that bay, that kind of bow-shaped bay, into a lagoon, and that's Tierra Bomba, which sits in between a very narrow passage at the southern end of the bay, called Boca Chica, which is 500 yards wide in total, only 160 yards that will take the draft of a ship. And then that Tierra Bomba stretches all the way up, and there's another small entrance just before the city, but it's too shallow to get anything in. So it means there's this wide lagoon that goes all the way up from the south, round to the north of the city, and it is ringed with forts, because obviously the Spanish have been in the Americas for a very long time. They've had 300 years, just shy of 300 years to build up this fortification, and my goodness, do they. So they have the city of Cartagena itself, which is walled. It's a suburb of Gethsemane, that's also walled. San Diego and San Felipe on the Tierra Bomba, they basically guard the kind of the seaward entrance approach. And then you have the fortress of San Luis at the entrance that basically sits on the Tierra Bomba, pointing out into the channel, and then you have San Josef, which is basically built on a rock in the middle of the channel. So you have these 2 smaller gun batteries and these 2 large forts holding the only entrance in, and then there are 2 other smaller forts, Castillo Grande and San Manzillo, I believe, that hold the kind of inner lagoon where you'd anchor your ships if you were trying to get stuff into the city. So there's at least 4 major forts, 3 smaller forts, plus the city's defences itself, and 4,000 Spaniards who rather you weren't there, thank you very much.
Any sail? Do they have naval support or nothing?
So De Leso brings over a relatively decent-sized fleet from Spain, and he's got 6 of those ships of the line with him in Cartagena. The rest he sent up to Havana to kind of stay with the fleet up there. So this is a very formidable position for this force to try to reduce. This is not the kind of Vernon has this idea from his capture of Portobello that basically all you need to do is turn up, show enough kind of blood and guts, and the Spanish will give up. Blas de Leso is not that kind of guy. He is not going to give up without a fight. And I think the defensive campaign he wages is at least as interesting as the British attempt to reduce the city.
And so, Tom, we've talked a lot about the forces and the geography, but before we actually start talking about the actual events of the campaign, can you kind of give us like a mission statement for each commander? Just kind of set us up.
So the Spanish one is actually quite easy. That is simply hold on, because this is a really interesting war in that Britain and France aren't at war yet. So Britain can focus Spain as its single course of action. Interestingly, they don't have enough men to go after like a big prize like the north coast of Spain or Havana itself, but they think they can get Cartagena. So the Spanish thing is hold on, either wait for the British army to die or wait for the French to show up. Is basically their strategic options. The British goal is not entirely clear, because they have a big debate after we're going to go to war with Spain. Public, very happy. They then turn around and go, what are we actually going to do? So they talk about an expedition to Manila, because they think we'll only need 1 battalion to go to Manila, and then all the riches of Cathay will flow into British coffers. They then go, well, yeah, we could go to Peru. Yeah, we can go to Peru. We can start raiding the coast of Peru. Then we can try and get the natives people in Peru to rise up and help us deal with the Spanish there. We can set up a colony, and we can kind of control the flow of trade down that side of the American coast. Okay. They then think, what about Havana? That's the big prize. And they go, come on, we can't take Havana. That is beyond our capability at this point in time. So they say, okay, well, what about Cartagena? Yeah, we can do Cartagena. When the expedition sails from Portsmouth, they do not know where they're going, because they leave the decision to a council of war of the senior army officers and the senior naval officers, plus the guy called Trelawney, who's the governor of Jamaica at the time. And they basically say, look, it's kind of like mission command taken to the extreme of when you get there, you can decide what you're going to do with the force that we've given you. It's probably Cartagena. So the British mission statement, I guess, is take a big Spanish city in Latin America. That is what they're trying to do. How they go about doing that is sort of left up to them, even though Cartagena is kind of the number one target.
Yikes.
Yeah, mission command at the strategic level is kind of a recipe for something to go absolutely horribly wrong.
Yeah, no kidding. Good grief. Awesome. And so, how do the Spanish react to this? I mean, I'm sure they don't roll out the red carpet for them.
No, they don't. But like I said, De Leso's a sensible guy. He does not, his 6 ships of the line are not going to engage in a naval battle with 22 sail of the line under Vernon, because that's suicide. What they actually do is they're basically quite content to let the British land. So they arrive off the coast, like I say, in early March. And they attack the 2 forts, San Diego and San Felipe, which are the kind of the 2. They're not really forts; they're more like batteries that hold the initial seaward channel towards the Boca Chica. And the British begin a bombardment just before noon, and by kind of 2:00 in the afternoon, the guns have fallen silent. The British don't know they've been abandoned, so the Spanish they don't try and hold the position to the last man at all. They basically see 22 sail of the line and some bomb catches blasting them with naval gunfire support, and decide, this isn't going to go very well, is it? And they give them up. The problem is the British don't know they've given them up. So what happens next is quite, I'm not going to say indefensible, but you're taking a heck of a lot of risk by doing this. And there's kind of 2 versions of this story. So what they do is, as all good British forces do in the 18th century, they form a converged grenadier battalion. So they take the grenadier companies of Wentworth, Harrison's, and the 6th Marine battalions. You are the elite of the elite. You are the spearhead, and they get them into boats, and one of 2 stories happen. Either they land initially, and Wentworth goes with them, and decides, I don't know if we have enough men to do this. and then pull back onto the boats to wait up, because obviously it takes a long time to disembark the men from the transports into the boats, get the boats formed up and get them going forward. This isn't like Havana. There are no dedicated landing craft. They're just using ship's boats to do this. So they get there. This is version 1 of the story. They get there, decide they haven't got enough men to overrun the battery, which curiously hasn't fired at them. Get back into the boats, wait 20 yards offshore in the surf in front of a gun battery. Again, this doesn't sound very plausible, and if it did happen this way, you're taking a heck of a lot of risk doing it. Wait for more men, then they go. The second is basically that they mill around waiting till the early evening until they have enough men together and then go as a big rush. And then it's sort of minor chaos that you normally get when you're trying to do an amphibious landing anyway, because everyone's jumping out, everyone's wet, boats are flipping over, all the rest of it, because you don't have real landing craft. So you either have version 1, which I think is the one from Charles Knowles, which makes Wentworth look completely idiotic, or version 2, which is just slightly shambolic. I tend to think version 2 sounds more likely, in that you would want to form your landing force up under the cover of the guns of this fleet rather than land. I could also understand just trying to rush the landing site with the first men that you can muster, but landing, withdrawing, waiting well within musket shot, let alone cannon range, and then going again a couple of hours later, that doesn't seem right to me. I think it probably was just a bit pained. But basically, by the 9th of March, the British are there. They have finally, 18 months after the declaration of war, they are in the Spanish Americas. They have a lodgment, and they're going to go and press on and besiege the fort of San Luis. And they do very well. They take pretty much a month to do it. I think it falls on the 25th of March, so just over 2 weeks. And they do very well. There's a guy called Justly Watson who's one of the engineers and leaves a very detailed journal. And he basically says, everything's going very well. Everyone works very hard. This is despite the fact. So Vernon, like I said, the Navy's struggling for manpower. Wentworth, quite naively, he's overawed by the great hero of Portobello. Of course you can have some Marines to be landsmen on the ships. Sir, could I have them back? Now we're here. No? The Navy's more important than the Army, Wentworth. Go on with it. What are you doing? So Wentworth is kind of starved for manpower. Now, it's very important to say, because they get left out, and I think when I've done talks before, I've left them out, and I don't want to do that. When they're in Jamaica, Trelawney, the governor, procures the labour of several hundred Jamaican, they call them hired labourers, which I think is a pretty hideous euphemism for what it must have actually have been. Maybe some of them were free men. I doubt that most of them were. They basically act as kind of porters, sappers, the labourers. So the Tierra Bomba, the island they've landed on at the mouth of the lagoon, is really heavily forested. So from the landing site they've taken at the batteries, they have to cut a track through the forest to where they're going to build the siege works. And it's all going pretty well. The battery fires its first shots on the 22nd of March, so 13 days after the initial landing. That's actually pretty good to cut a track through a jungle forest in the Caribbean and build a battery with not very many men. That's quite good going. And Watson is his account reads as quite ebullient. Vernon, because he's this sort of aggressive, no-nonsense sailor, decides that no, this is far too slow, Wentworth. Your boys are taking too long. So he decides to throw his ships in an attack against San Luis and San Jose, and I think pretty much 3 ships, they're pretty much written out the order of battle for any kind of reasonable period of time. 3 ships of the line just smashed to pieces. One of them is very nearly lost. It's a complete debacle. The next day, they get a practicable breach after only 2 days of bombardment. So Vernon, in this massive fit of pique, has thrown his fleet against these forts, been completely rebuffed, and then a day later, the army have a breach. The next day, Colonel Grant leads 500, basically 500 men is the Grenadier Battalion at this point. They lead the Grenadier Battalion over the works into the breach. Basically, the Spanish withdraw because at this point, the fort's not in a great place anyway. They say there's no point trying to hold the fort to the last man when they've got a breach, they've got the ships outside, they're in. Let's withdraw. So what De Lesso actually does is he sinks 3 ships of the line in the channel to try and block the British. Again, it's not he's not precious. He's an admiral ordering 3 ships of the line to be scuttled, basically, to try and to just cause the British a pain. They do capture the 60-gun Galicia. Basically, I think unfortunately it's Charles Knowles. Actually, he leads a boarding party, and they manage to capture her before the Spanish can abandon her or set fire to her. But they've essentially taken by the 26th. Knowles is in Fort San Jose because, again, they don't try and waste men trying to hold this fort that they can never possibly hold against the forces arrayed against it. Like I say, fence is not in a great place. You're heavily outnumbered. The sensible thing to do is spike the guns, fall back to the next defensive line. But because they've sunk the ships in the channel, the British have to spend 4 days moving the fleet into the lagoon. So again, that clock is ticking. And if you run the kind of the maths on, if you take modern force effectiveness ratios, you lose 20% of your men, your combat effectiveness drops. I can't remember what the figure is now, but your effectiveness drops by a disproportionate amount to that 20%. The Spanish are kind of aware of this, and there's that clock is ticking. It's worth saying at this point, a third of the British, not including the American contingent, a third of the British troops are sick or dead by the time that they get to Cartagena. They've not been well on the transports on the way over. They've not been properly fed. Things like scurvy, typhus. They've done their nasty work before. So when Vernon is very much like time. We don't have time, and you can see why, because their army is not in a good shape when they get to the Caribbean. De Lesso probably isn't aware of this completely, but he knows the clock is ticking for the Brits, and by the time they get into the lagoon and are in a place to land, it's the 5th of April. So they've already been in front of the walls of the city for a month by the time they're ready to put a foot on the mainland.
The Spanish are delaying the British, but what's their morale like? How are their troops faring in this so far in this campaign?
Hello listeners, this is Andrew. We often say that history is written by the victors, but on this show we know it's actually written by the supply lines, by the weather, and by the difficult decisions made inside the command tent. Sometimes the most interesting part of our recording session isn't the battle narrative. It's the 20-minute debate or analysis we have between the key actions. If you enjoy those what-if moments, I invite you to become part of the Prime and Load War Room on Patreon. For the price of a pint, you can hear the conversations that usually end up on the cutting room floor. You'll also get access to our newsletter, The Orderly Book, as well as exclusive bonus episodes that cover topics we typically don't get to on the main show. So if you're the kind of person who's looking for more 18th century warfare, join the Prime and Load War Room at patreon.com/primeandload.
So from what I can gauge pretty well, so there's a really good diary actually written by a militiaman after the Battle of San Lazar later in the campaign, and obviously they win this engagement again. Spoiler alert. But he's very ebullient. They seem they're basically up for this. I think. My guess is the British taking so long to do things. No, they're doing everything very competently. Everything is actually going quite well from a kind of a purely like kind of technocratic perspective. Everything is going well. But I think the Spanish know they have time on their side, and they have a lot of faith in De Lesso. And this is another where the Nelson comparison might work, is the men do really seem to respect him. Deslava, who in theory outranks him, does seem to defer a lot to De Lesso. Again, this guy is hugely experienced. He knows what he's doing. So I think the Spanish are holding up very well. When the British land on the 5th of April, the Spanish, instead of like retreating behind a fortress, they actually try and hold a position against the British. So the British land at a place, I think it's called La Guira, and John Grant, this clan chief, leads the Grenadiers forward. And this is the thing we were talking about before we started recording, about the weird use of urban fighting TTPs, to tactics, techniques, and procedures to try and force a way through the jungle. So what the British find is, and this comes from a chap called Lord Elibank, and Lord Elibank writes one of the most detailed accounts of the campaign. He doesn't enjoy his time in what is now Colombia even slightly, to the point that 4 years later he straps on a kilt and picks up a broadsword for the Bonnie Prince, because he's decided he's had enough with the cause of the House of Hanover. To be honest, reading some of the accounts of Cartagena, I could kind of understand being radicalized by that as well. But he writes this account of the British force that, like I say, Converged Grenadier Battalion, the best guys in the army. They advance up this jungle track from the landing point. And it's at a place, I believe it's a place called near La Quinta. It's a small village. They find that there's a clearing, and the Spanish have actually formed a regular battalion, small battalion in front of the British path. And the British are constrained on a narrow track. They can't deploy into line. They don't really have time. So they use this technique called street firing, which is basically you're in a column of platoons, and the lead platoon presents, fires, and then trots back down the edge of the column. The next platoon comes forward, presents fire, and the idea is that you're essentially canalized in an urban, we'd call it an urban canyon, I guess, but it doesn't really work in that time period anyway. It's a way of delivering rolling fire down a street without essentially having to deploy into any kind of proper battlefield formation, and they do it really well. And basically, Elibank says, the Spanish do try. It's not like it's they just break at the first volley, but basically the Grenadiers are able to lay down such a fierce volley, rolling platoon fire, that the Spanish do break, and that's when the Grenadiers charge with the bayonet. Now, as the Spanish are running, they're running towards the convent of La Popa and the fortress of San Lazar, and the Wentworth has landed at this point, and he sees basically the Grenadiers led by this clan chief chasing the Spanish forces towards the city. Wentworth makes the call, stop, and he sends a runner to Grant and says, it's off. Hold the men. Do not try and capture San Lazar in a bayonet charge, and do not try and get into the city with them. So William Burrard, who's an officer in one of the Marine battalions, sort of says, and Elibank too, kind of go, it's a bit of a shame, we'd have got him pell-mell, classic British officer, just let us at him and we'd have got in pell-mell, we'd have taken the whole city in an afternoon, all the rest of it. And some historians, Admiral Richmond's written a book about Cartagena as well. This is awful, this is Wentworth, coward, blah, blah, blah. Wuss, doesn't understand what he's doing, timid. Well, actually, that's his best battalion. The Converged Grenadiers are his best men. And you do not want them smashed to pieces on the wall of a fortress, or, God forbid, a city, on the first day that you've arrived on the mainland of your objective. He is, in my view, he's completely right to say, do not risk the destruction of our best troops in a pell-mell chase against a fortified position. But basically, after that fight, and it's really interesting, actually, I was like I said, talking to Alex beforehand, you see the British do this at numerous other points when they're fighting the Caribbean during the long 18th century. Because anyone who's been to the Caribbean will know, you have a lot of like narrow roads, narrow tracks, like little streams and gullies that only have a couple of crossing points, even now. And the way the British force these at these encounters is by using that urban fighting doctrine. Now, I'm not sure that this is like institutional legacy that's carried over from Cartagena, that they know how to do this from that engagement. There are a couple of names that I've picked up being involved in the Cartagena battle who are then involved in the subsequent battle. So maybe there is a kind of, I'm pretty sure the guys, this is how we did this last time. Maybe there is a bit of that. But they use this urban street firing TTP at numerous points in Guadeloupe. 1758 is a really good example of that. So it's just an interesting twist of how the British Army, it learns all these drill book procedures, but it is forced to fight in. I think it's fair to say the British Army is probably the one that's forced to fight in the most diverse and unique situations, just because of Britain's strategic position. But yeah, so it's now it's the 5th of April. The British are ashore. They've captured the convent of La Popa, and they're looking down at San Lazar. They're looking down at Cartagena City, and for them, I think at that point they thought, we've got it. We've cracked the outer defences. We've taken basically 4 forts in a month. They've sunk half their ships. We've got this, guys. They're on the run, and then it all falls apart.
So what goes wrong? Do you want to take us through the San Lazar operation? Because I know this is the crunch point, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, so the crunch point, and a lot of accounts of Cartagena do San Lazar in more detail than anything else, and mine's no different, because it is the most interesting tactical action, but it's also the point of you sent a new army with relatively fresh officers, bad command and control, to a place to do a very difficult thing, and it's very rare that you see all of those things, those strategic and operational failures stack up and basically go wrong on a single night. And that is the Battle of San Lazar. So there's a big debate, and there's a lot of there's a lot's been written about this by Richard Harding, and I won't go into the whole thing. Basically, there's a huge debate between the Army and the Navy about how they deal with this fortress. So it's on a little teardrop-shaped hill. Teardrop runs north to south. You've got a square fort, and the kind of, I guess, the southwestern face, the face kind of closest to the British, that is pretty much a sheer cliff. And that's the kind of the flattest face of the fortress, and the rest folds round. The only entrance is actually directly opposite the city on the kind of eastern edge of it. If you buy the book, British Amphibious Warfare 1739 to 1815, edited by Andrew Bamford, you will find a very lovely map of San Lazar drawn by yours truly, and it makes the point a lot clearer than I can in this with the medium of my voice. And basically, that fort is the point at which actually a French buccaneer attack had gone in pretty much 50 years before and taken it by storm. The Spanish are aware, and it's actually still there. So it might tell you that the Spanish think this is a closer run thing than the British might think it was, by the fact you can go to Cartagena now and you can go to San Lazar, but it is now the center. The small fort they attack in 1741 is the centerpiece of a huge citadel. Basically, they dig up the entire hill that the fort is on and turn it into a defensive, like a Vauban-style fort. So it's a key linchpin of the city, and they know this at the time. So Desnos, the engineer, he builds from the northern corner of the fort. They build a hornwork. So Fascines, Gambians, they build out this kind of mini bastion to hold troops. Around the northern edge of the wall, they dig some trenches, just to again either slow the British. Some of the accounts have them filled with water, some with troops. So it feels like there's more than one line of trenches. They then have on the sheer side of the hill, the side facing the British, they put a battery on either end of the wall to reinforce the bastion, and they dig even more trenches. So they've kind of they've actually been working on this since the British arrived. Basically, they turn up and Desnos goes, the point of decision will be San Lazar. We need to make sure that it is the toughest nut to crack that we can possibly make it. So the Spanish are turning this into an earthworked, reinforced position, as well as the fort itself. The fort itself is nothing particularly special. It mounts relatively few cannon, and like I said, it's held by one lieutenant and 26 guys. Itself, obviously, there are going to be troops in the trenches when we get to the battle. I think they put 300 men from the regiment de Aragon into the outer works. So 326 men. It's fairly formidable when you're behind trenches and all the rest of it. But like I say, from the kind of the 6th, the 7th, and the 8th of April, the British commanders have a debate. And it swings between Vernon saying, you need to storm this fortress, kind of Wellington style, ladders, grappling hooks, up and over, go and get them. And Wentworth and his men going, we really need a breach. We should try and do this properly. There is no reason, we're winning, let's not rush. Now, Vernon is terrified of the rains and yellow fever decimating the army. Again, not completely unreasonably. They're already suffering attrition through disease at this point, but Wentworth is much more cautious. And then Vernon at one point consents to try and form a breach, but says, well, you can't have any more men from the fleet to do that. You're going to have to do that on your own. Bearing in mind the men that Wentworth is asking for from the fleet are soldiers. They're not... they're not sailors he's asking for. He's asking for his own men, and Vernon is saying no. So the long and the short of it is, on the 8th of April, the British Army holds a council, and they agree to an escalade, so an attempt with ladders to try and storm the fort. John Guise, the guy I said is an eccentric art collector, he's the only one that goes, yes, sir, this is a great plan. Blakeney, who's the guy who defends Stirling Castle in Minorca, there are several accounts of him actually saying, I want my note of protest appended to the minutes from this meeting. I think this is a bloody terrible idea. We should have a breach. And sort of say, okay, understood, Colonel. Your opinion is valid. We're doing it anyway. And that's how you get to 1 a.m. on the 9th of April. What for us is probably closer to the 20th, 21st of April, because the British use a different calendar to the rest of Europe, because we're British, we have to be different. Nothing's changed. So the morning, 1 a.m. on the 9th of April, the British are going to launch an attack on Saint-Lazare. And like Andrew said earlier, this is kind of the force of the article I've written recently of how this goes badly wrong.
So we're still seeing, after this later stage, we're still seeing that very aggressive relationship between Wentworth and Vernon, and it seems like it's pushing them towards bad ideas at this point.
So Vernon is pushing them. He essentially thinks the army's being too slow. The British army is conducting itself in the way that an 18th century army would conduct itself in Europe. And they're actually doing it pretty well. Wentworth actually goes on to be I think he's a wing commander or a division commander under Wade during the 45. So the guy is not an idiot. He knows how to be a soldier in a European context. I do think there is a qualitative difference, and it is hard to quantify this in some ways. There is a qualitative difference between being a really good European field commander and being able to do kind of bleeding edge operations in an expeditionary fashion in an environment that is trying to kill you. And you can kind of see this in the history of the British Army with guys like Bill Slim, of you are on the end of the earth and everything around you is trying to kill you. You need a very different mindset, I think. And I think for World War II people, a good comparison is like a Montgomery. Great for kind of, opinions may vary on that one, but I know Andrew's not the biggest fan. I'm not.
I'm descended from a 14th Army veteran. I'm Slim all the way on that one.
Yeah, I've got family who are in the Indian Army or serve with the Indian Army as well. I'm a slim guy too, but the kind of the guy for the European operations and the guy for the cutting edge expeditionary stuff, and Wentworth's the guy for the European operations. And like you say, Lee, you're exactly right. Vernon is kind of trying to snooker them into what he wants to do. So, yeah, we can have the battery, but you can't have any more men. Well, then you can't have the battery because you can't build a siege battery without the labour to actually do it. And if you can't have the labour, then the only option you have is either go home or storm the fortress. And to be honest, I've actually said before, the real sensible command decision here from a British perspective is you've captured 4 forts. Garrison them, leave. If you're worried about the rains, come back in the dry season. Because you can actually hold what you've got. They have no way of getting supplies into the city at this point. If you control the harbour, the Spanish, they can try and besiege you and force you out. That's absolutely fine, but you've got naval superiority. Play the long game. Actually, the sensible operational level thinking is not that this one linchpin needs to be forced, but that's what they decide to do.
And how does that go for them?
They devise a plan that is courageous, shall we say, in the kind of the euphemistic lexicon of Britain. It is a very courageous plan, Minister, and and parts of it go quite well. So the idea is you're going to have 2 columns. The whole operation, for a reason I've never been able to understand, is going to be commanded by General Guise, the art collector. He's going to be an overall commander of the assault, which Wentworth is going to be in. The commander of the land component is giving a junior deputy command of the attack that he is going to participate in. Wentworth is going to accompany his regiment, but he's not going to lead it. So he's going to leave the lieutenant colonel to do what the lieutenant colonel should do, but he as colonel proprietor is going to stand and sort of, come on, my brave boys, forward. I don't understand really how that works. And the main force is going to be commanded by a guy called Colonel John Wynyard. Wynyard is one of the colonels proprietor of the Marine regiments, and that's going to be a forlorn hope of a dozen men led by a sergeant, 30 volunteers led by a chap called Lieutenant Waller. You've then got 450 men of the Converged Grenadier Battalion, so even then, they've not actually taken many casualties in the field, and they've already lost 10% from the Grenadiers. So you can start seeing where this is going in terms of the sickness rates in the army. A company of Harrison's 15th, 50 men, we're told, led by Colonel Moreton, who's one of the Marine colonels. Now, I have no idea why this Marine colonel, senior staff officer on the expedition, decides to be a company commander for this one. Maybe he just wanted a part of the glory. He'll probably come to regret that. You then have a group of American soldiers led by a Scottish officer called John Mackenzie and another engineer subaltern called Mr. Thomas. The Americans in this battle will go into the fight unarmed. They are going to be carrying wool packs for filling trenches, so they're basically sandbags. They're going to be carrying the Grenadiers' grenades for the escalade, and they're going to be carrying the ladders, and they're going to be at the back of Wynyard's column, and there's also going to be some of them at the back of Grant's column. So, again, it's kind of confusing. Colonel Grant, the guy who led the Grenadier Battalion in the last battle, is now the column commander for Wentworth's column in the north. They impose a really Byzantine command system on this battle, and I really do not understand why they do that. Given Grant's led the Grenadier Battalion twice really, really well, let's give him command of Wentworth's regiment, who's going to be with his own regiment that has its own lieutenant colonel anyway for the diversion attack. Again, very strange. You then have a reserve of Edward Wolfe's regiment. Edward Wolfe is in command of that. This is the most sensible part of the operation. Wolfe is in command of the reserve. They have some Royal Artillery there as well, with Wolfe's regiment led by the lieutenant colonel. That's very sensible. The idea for Wynyard's column is it's going to go skirt the base of the hill on a goat track that's hidden by some trees, and they're going to go round and attack the basically undefended single door into the fort that faces the city. They're going to do this all at night, so that the guns of the city can't basically smash Wynyard's column as they swing round that goat track up the soft. So basically, the hill is steep on basically three sides, and they're going to go up the soft side into the door, and basically they're going to be the guys that overwhelm the fortress. They're going to do it at night, so they have the element of surprise. They're going to be led by Spanish deserters or prisoners. Now, these guys are either, depending on the accounts you read, they're either Genoese sailors who were captured, or they're actual Spanish deserters. It's not really clear which they are, but they're going to use those guys rather than their own engineers who'd scouted the fort a couple of days before. And that's on Vernon's. Vernon is absolutely insistent. Use the Spanish. Don't use your own engineers. I don't trust them. Use the Spanish deserters. Why you'd make that decision? Again, it's baffling. But they decide that they're going to do this. So if we imagine now, we're the British. It's 1 a.m. on the 9th of April. It's probably about 25 degrees. You're in your wool coat and your cocked hat with your musket and your pack.
So that sounds absolutely freezing for Americans. I'm guessing that's actually a
sorry,
warm
yeah, that's
temperature?
25 degree. That's 25 degrees Celsius, 25 degrees of the king's degrees. Yes, so it's very hot. It takes them 2 hours to form up. So it's 3 a.m. by the time they start moving off. Grant's column swings around first and goes around for the north of the hill, and Wynyard's column sets off. And they're going up the goat track. Unfortunately, and accounts on exactly how this happens do differ, the deserter/prisoner/guide is spotted by the pickets, and he either tips them the griff and says, "Los Ingles," or the guys on the picket actually recognise him and fire a shot. At which point, the forlorn hope, Lieutenant Waller, the sergeant, they basically go, "Right, we're going." They overwhelm the outstation. You could say the element of surprise is kind of blown at this point. The British then blow it further by, and the account is very clear. Elibank's account is very clear of this. The band plays. They have a marching band with them that plays the British Grenadiers on a surprise attack. They scream "Huzzay, huzzay, huzzay!" The British Grenadiers strike up and they surge forward. This is where it all goes wrong. They surge forward up the wrong part of the hill. So instead of breaking the tree line on the nice soft incline with the gate, they break incline into the sheer cliff, mounted by Spanish defensive works. Now, the Spanish some guns go off from the city, but the guys in the trenches, the troops that De Lesso has put in the trenches, the fort, and the guns in the fort, don't fire at this point. But there's a lot of accounts of the British basically having to sling their muskets over their backs and go up on kind of Plains of Abraham style, where they're climbing hand over fist, except they're doing it into the Spanish trenches. Now, Alex is going to be really upset with me because the Spanish hold their fire. 25, 40 yards, accounts vary. They let the British basically form up on the brow of the hill, is my kind of interpretation. And then they just...
The British aren't shooting back, so why wouldn't you hold your fire? Let them come up close, get a good shot.
Well, exactly. The British have no way of firing back at you. You're exactly right. And one of the accounts describes it as one perpetual light. I mean, it's really interesting, actually. You read the journals of these guys, and you think they're Georgian gentlemen. They're not going to be particularly effusive. They're not going to have the kind of raw emotion that we might display now. This sounds absolutely bloody terrifying. From everything I've read of this, it sounds horrific. So they hold the fire until they're within 25, 40 yards. Grant's column, meanwhile, they've slung around the top, and the 24th have got to the hornwork. And again, the Spanish hold their fire there, 25, 40 yards. The British are advancing down the narrow, it's a teardrop hill. They're advancing down that narrow point towards the hornwork. Their guide leads them onto the hornwork. Now, it's not entirely clear what happens, whether Colonel Grant is killed outright. All the Spanish accounts seem to say he was taken prisoner, so I'm guessing that's not the case. But they basically the 24th go, right, we're going. Grant, Highland Chief leading this experienced regiment, goes, we're going, leads them down into the trench at the base of the hornwork. He is shot. He is basically mortally wounded. He is completely out of the fight. In the grand tradition of the 24th, they reform from this failed charge, and they exchange platoon fire with the defences. And they stand there for several hours exchanging fire with the defences. And Wentworth is leading this regiment. And at no point does he think to either abandon the diversionary attempt or attempt to attack the hornwork himself. The best part of this is, and it's kind of a testament to Grant and the 24th, the Spanish think it's the real effort because they know that's where the French got in before, and they fight so bloody hard that they assume, and also Wynyard's attack is up completely the wrong part of the fort. That must be the diversion. These guys are the guys trying to get into the fort, and they're really worried about that. And De Lesso sends 200 armed sailors into trenches around the northern part of the fort, thinking that's the main attack. So anyway, Grant's column, the 24th, well, Grant's mortally wounded now. Wentworth or his lieutenant colonel's column, they're pinned on the northern end of the fort. Wynyard's column are trying to force their way up the slope in front of the fortress on the southwestern edge with the trench lines. Now, they breach one or two of those trench lines. They actually, the Grenadiers do get in and force a small breach. We're then told by this chap, Mackenzie, who's a captain in the engineers, that they use street firing in the gap in the trench lines, which I find slightly bizarre. We're told that they can only sort of force 4 to 8 men abreast through this gap. So the way they're doing it is they're actually forcing a small number of guys up, a couple of files, exchanging fire with the fortifications, and then withdrawing back. Mackenzie becomes kind of a celebrity in this battle, I guess, because and this is an account written by him afterwards, so you do have to take it with a pinch of salt. But there's a guy called Captain Dennett, who's one of the Grenadier commanders, and he is shot and killed, or mortally wounded, and his men bring him back. And they say, "Sir, can you lead us onward?" And Mackenzie kind of says, "Oh, I don't know." And there are calls at this point for the ladders, for the Americans to bring up the ladders. And Mackenzie said, "Well, we've not had any orders." They wait for an order to bring the ladders up. And this is where the British accounts differ somewhat from the American accounts of what happens here. The American accounts say the Americans fought very well and their marksmen took expert aim and picked off the Spanish defenders. The British accounts all say the Americans ran away and that only one American officer and a couple of his men helped them get the ladders up. I think the truth is probably somewhere in between that. But also, I don't blame the American soldiers for legging it because they didn't have weapons. And some of them we do know did pick up firearms and actually fight as part of the formation with the British. So there's that. And basically, Mackenzie leads this small shattered platoon of grenadiers on kind of a one platoon. I mean, this would make a great like Band of Brothers style scene where you've got this young engineer officer leading this broken platoon of grenadiers through the defences, and they get to the kind of the base of the wall where they meet the Forlorn Hope. So some of the Forlorn Hope and their officer, Lieutenant Waller, have actually survived at this point, and the British are panicking, and they're basically just shooting at anything that they think is a Spanish guy behind the defences. They don't know what they're doing. They're blasting away, all the rest of it. And Mackenzie says, for the love of God, stop doing this. You're going to shoot your own men. You don't know what you're doing. Your fire is completely wasted. If you're going to do anything, at least aim for the gun battery that's firing grape shot down on our men. And eventually, this feels like this goes on for at least 2 hours. And they then pull the men back off. Mackenzie says this is hopeless and pulls his men back down to the base of the hill where he meets... I believe it's. I think he meets Colonel Wolfe, and he says to Wolfe, "Sir, this is lost, but maybe we can find another way to win this." And Wolfe kind of goes, "Okay, well, this is clearly not going very well." And interestingly, he doesn't go meet Colonel Wynyard, who's theoretically in command of his column, and Colonel Wynyard is not killed or wounded, so we have no idea what he's doing, and he's not gone to Guise either, the guy in actual command of the assault. He goes to Wolfe, who is presumably the most... he already had a reputation for being competent, right? So he goes to the guy that he knows is going to be able to get them out of this. And Wolfe goes, go around to the northern edge of the fort, see what you can find, and let me know. Mackenzie goes round, takes his men to the northern end of the fort, realises it's stuffed full of those sailors that de Lethal sent as a reinforcement. He goes back to Wolfe and says, "Sir, this is hopeless. We need..." And this is very brave. This is a captain telling a sort of temporary brigadier, "Sir, we're losing. Can we go?" And he's very sanguine with him, which I always think is quite interesting. And Wolfe basically sends him to go to speak to Wentworth, see what's happening. The long and the short of it is that the British are being degraded. They're being shot to pieces. I think one of the British officers, Burrard, he's from near where I grew up in Hampshire. Actually, he describes his men as being broke to pieces. They're having stones thrown down on them. They're having grenades hurled at them. They're having musket fire, grape shot, all the rest of it. And they're being slowly broken apart. And eventually, Wentworth actually says, Mackenzie delivers Wolfe's report to Wentworth, and Wentworth goes, "No, carry on. We need to redouble the assault. If we have to, we commit the reserve. We go. We have to win this battle." Which I just think, you're watching your own regiment for the last 2 hours be shot to pieces. You've just heard a report from an engineering officer that the other column is basically in tatters, and your orders are essentially to just keep going again. The stunning lack of grasp of what's going on from the reports of your junior officers, I think this is the real thing where Wentworth, it's kind of unforgivable. The brave call now is to call it off. And Mackenzie gets back to Wolfe. Wolfe says, "No, this is over." And what they actually do is they pull the column down off that steep slope of the hill, and they form up below, right at the bottom of the hill, and they're kind of undecided as to what to do next. At this point, de Lethal, again, the Spanish are not passive. They've been active this whole fight. They've been feeding reinforcements in, really working out where the shattering point of the British forces. De Lethal sees them recoil, pulling back. He then leads a sally with a peg leg. This is pretty cool. Leads a sally out of Cartagena. And at this point, depending on the account you believe, either the column under Wynyard breaks and flees, or they withdraw in good order. I tend to think the Spanish say they break and flee. One of the British officers says they break and flee. One of the guys in the column says, no, it was an orderly withdrawal. I tend to think I believe the guys watching it happen, or the guys chasing them. So the British flee. Wolfe forms his battalion up in 3 ranks, essentially as a breakwater to stop de Lethal's attack. De Lethal thinks there's no point risking the advantage we've won. We've smashed them to pieces on the hill. There's no point risking in a field battle. The Spanish then withdraw back to their defences. The British withdraw back to their camp at La Quinta. And the Battle of San Lazar is over. The British withdrawal happens about 7 a.m. So they've been fighting for 3 hours. So the British troops are enduring this basically trench fighting. Some of the accounts read like the accounts of trench raids from the First World War. They've been doing that for 3 hours under constant fire.
There are 1,500 men in the whole assault. 500 of those are in the reserve, more or less. So 1,000 men actually go over the top in more modern parlance. 640 of them, all ranks, killed and wounded, including Colonel Grant, whose last words, according to both British and Spanish sources, are the general ought to hang the guide and the king ought to hang the general. His dying words are, please shoot my boss when you get back to England. It goes hideously wrong. And really, this shatters the 24th, Wentworth's. This shatters the Grenadiers. Harrison, the company of Harrison's men that go with the Grenadiers, they're broken as well. And it rips the heart out of the death of Grant. There's a chap, William Burrard, I mentioned, he's one of the Grenadier officers. He gets shot in the back of the knee. And he says, I'm just grateful they didn't break the bone because I would have died in the climate. The British are really struggling at this point. Their heart's been ripped out of the army. And basically, they try and carry on the battle, the campaign, with a conventional siege, but their hearts aren't in it. And a month later, out of an army of 10,000, the sickness that Vernon feared did hit. So a month after Saint Lazare, they have 3,000 men fit out of a total of 10,000 that were supposed to arrive there. And they've only lost maybe 700 of those in the face of the enemy. So they've lost well over 6,000 men to sickness, dead and not fit for fighting. So it's a really hideous campaign. And at this point, the relationship between Wentworth and Vernon is destroyed. They don't ever get back to any kind of sensible working relationship after this. And then they withdraw, like I say, basically almost exactly a month after the battle at Saint Lazare. The British abandon everything. They don't just retreat back to where they started and hold some of the forts on Tierra Bomba. They spike whatever they've got and they get back in their transports and go all the way back to Jamaica. You get the sense from Elibank and Burrard and Mackenzie that these guys are broken by the end of this. The fighting itself is horrific. The guys that were, because both Elibank, Burrard and Mackenzie, all of them were at Saint Lazare. And you get the sense that fighting was particularly traumatic, even by the standards of the day. It must be very demoralising when sort of 70% of the men in your force are sick or dead. Their hearts are really not in it anymore. They're shattered. Actually, Elibank is a lieutenant colonel, like I said. He basically says, I'm the only person who hasn't been promoted as a result of this battle. That's when he chucks in his commission and goes back to Britain. And I think it probably informs a lot of why he ends up throwing his lot in with the Jacobites. He's a Highlander himself, or at least from the north of Scotland, so he's in that milieu anyway. But this is a traumatic battle for the men involved, and you can really get, when you read their accounts, you can really get the sense of that, the way they talk about, our men being shattered, torn to pieces, the perpetual light of the Spanish musketry. It's much more vivid than a lot of the accounts you get of battles in this time period.
Any idea in the same period how many casualties the Spanish suffer?
To be fair, they've got 25% of their regular forces are already sick when it starts, because these guys aren't any more immune to the diseases than the British are. Obviously, they can be slightly more well cared for in the city than the British can be in the field. Really, you get the sense, I think the Spanish, they say they lose a couple of dozen, maybe, max, killed and wounded during the Battle of Saint Lazare. Obviously, they lose a few men killed or wounded in prisoners in the earlier exchanges, but I would wager the casualties for the Spanish are probably below, the killed and wounded in fighting, well below 200 in the whole campaign.
And so the British, like you said, just pick up and leave. What's the reaction back in England? What's kind of the aftermath, the fallout from this campaign?
So the first dispatches they sent back, they say they've won. So when they capture the outer forts, and they basically send a dispatch when they're landing just before they get to Saint Lazare, going, "This is all going swimmingly, chaps." So there are people ringing bells. Vernon's a national hero again. Walpole fights an election like 10 days before the Battle of Saint Lazare. The election starts, and he wins like a tiny majority because he's really unpopular by this point. The Patriot Whigs and the Tories are like 30 seats behind him or something silly like that in Parliament. And that's 10 days before Saint Lazare. So the initial reaction is kind of relief from the government. And then as the reports start filtering back over the kind of couple of months, they get back to Jamaica in June, I think, at some point in June. Over the next couple of months, the government start getting reports back of just quite how badly it's gone. And that's when you start getting already the partisans on both sides starting to spin narratives about who did what. That's why when Knowles comes back and writes his account, it very selectively releases confidential papers from Vernon to back up his side of the story. Obviously, Wentworth's response in any response that doesn't show Vernon in a great light is redacted. So you have this kind of one-sided war of letters going on. But at no point do they decide that the West Indies campaign is over. They decide that they're not going to go back to England. They're not even going to rest and reconstitute the army in Jamaica for that long. They actually then decide to go and invade Cuba later in the year. I think it's September. And they're going to be led by, again, Craig Chapman wrote a brilliant book on this recently. They're going to be led by a former pirate who's going to try and lead them on an expedition to capture Santiago de Cuba in the south coast of Cuba. And they end up in a weird sort of quixotic way trying to colonize Guantanamo Bay. And they actually have reinforcements sent out from England to help them. And Wentworth is promoted via seniority to Major General during this period. The campaign rolls on for about another year before the government basically say, you are getting nowhere with this and we're at war with France now. You need to come home. We need to recover what is left of the army, what is left of the fleet. It needs to be brought back. And then Vernon basically he never works again. I think at the time people were aware that he was a problem for the army. And like I say, Wentworth has a pretty good war, pretty good Austrian succession. He goes, reconstitutes his army, his regiment in 1743, leads the reconstitution of the 24th. Then goes over to Flanders, does okay, comes back to the 45, again, does okay, doesn't do brilliantly, but has a reasonable career afterwards. And then guys like Blakeney actually go on to have he's well thought of. Vernon, like I say, doesn't work out. Knowles does become quite senior, and his sons and that do go on to have relatively senior posts in the Navy. So he comes out of it with his reputation relatively intact. And a lot of guys don't come out of it at all. I think that's the kind of the main story here. The human cost is, and it really kicks in when you read the letters from when they get to Cuba, when they really give up. The human cost of this expedition is in the orders of sort of 70 to 90%. It's truly horrific, and the cadre of guys who come back to England that reform these regiments, they're very experienced, but they've been put through absolute hell.
So I think I've always got to ask this at the end. From this campaign, what do you think modern military professionals can learn?
So much, and I think this is probably one for Andy Young, because he is a scholar of great renown on this subject. But I think really what you need to learn is, if you're going to do this deep overseas expeditionary warfare on a huge scale, you need a preponderance of force that means that you can absorb some of the blows that they took at Cartagena. When you look at some of the later expeditions the British do, they send a much larger force in comparison to the garrison they're facing. They send qualitatively much better troops. So you look at St. Lucia in 1778 or Havana in 62, they send the best guys they have available to do the job at hand. And I think that is what you need. You need the experienced officers, you need the experienced men who are going to be able to adapt and fight the battle in front of them rather than the one they're trained to fight. The other thing the British nail later in the century, sometimes not, that modern militaries need to learn is you need a really good, clear command and control structure. Which element, the land component, the air component now, the maritime component, is responsible for what areas of the operation, who is taking these decisions, and who is accountable for them under what chain of command. Do not have this botched council of war, different officers leading different units sort of style of operation. When you have very difficult objectives to achieve in a difficult climate, that is not friction you need to introduce to your system. And I think the other one is have a clear objective when you go. Don't just say go and nick a Spanish port. Pick an objective, pick the right people to lead the operation, and pick the right force to do it. Start from that perspective. Don't let the public bully you into a war that you might need to fight anyway, but at least try and have a sensible, thought-out policy from that. What are our strategic objectives? Therefore, what are our operational objectives? Therefore, what are our force that we need to send? Therefore, what are our TTPs? You don't just make it up as you go along, basically. Long and short of it.
Awesome. Well, Tom, this has been fantastic.
No, thank you so much for having me on, guys, and letting me waffle for 2 hours. Just another thing of going by. I know none of you are going to see me on camera, but going by the book, British Amphibious Warfare, 1739 to 1815, Success and Failure Across 5 Continents, edited by Andrew Bamford, forward by Professor Richard Harding himself, and featuring yours truly.
I can't think of a better note to end it on than that.
That's it for this episode of Prime and Load. We hope you enjoyed us as much as we did. Don't forget to sign up for our free newsletter with the link in the description. It's the best way to stay up to date with the show, see what's coming up next, and ask us questions. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. This episode was hosted by Drs. Alexander Burns and Andrew Bamford. It was produced by Lee Gugino, music by Brianna Tam, Ardy Son, and Adrian Beringer. Prime and Load is a Historic Studios podcast.